a place in the middle of the crossroads that must be followed by the catch of breath. In those moments, imagination and tenacity teach each of us who we are and who we might become. Let's pretend for a second that it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you can't sleep. What fear is in the core of you? What are you thinking about? What is it that keeps you up at night? Is it public speaking? Sorry, I think I'm projecting here. But in all seriousness, is it fear of being alone, being isolated, fear of something terrible happening to someone in your family, or is it the fear of death? Those are the things that are at the top of the list of what we are most afraid of. And what they have in common is the intersection of change with our story, with narrative, the crossroads. When we consider the crossroads and our fear and the way in which those things intersect, I'm curious what would happen if we were to, as a collective, go into each other's bedrooms and confront that fear, to have a conversation about what those fears are, and to try and unpack them. Fear is like the termite behind the wall. As you know, termites eat away at the structure. And if everything is not exposed, the structure collapses. How much of our public dysfunction is rooted in that fear and our inability to share it and to expose it with each other? In 2012, I was driving to work, as I always do, and I pulled up to an intersection with a red light. When the light turned green, I proceeded into the intersection, and what I found was another car running a red light. If I hadn't slammed on the brakes, I'm convinced that I would have been killed or very, very seriously injured. At the time, I did not have this experience to understand that that was an opportunity. It was a moment when I could have reflected on my life and done an assessment that might have helped my life to be richer. I don't want you to not have that opportunity. I'm a literature critic and a poet, and so the idea of narrative as being important is not in the least bit unfamiliar to me. However, it's not my professional life, but my personal life that leads me to the conviction that narrative can help us grapple with the things that we most fear and the things that keep us up at night. Literature professors have a little bit of a crazy reputation for running around saying things like carpe diem, seize the day, live every day as your last. And what would happen if we actually tried to do that? Can you imagine? It would be chaos, I believe. We would, in fact, either succumb to the extremes of excess, eating donuts and spending all of our money, that would be me, or in complete paralysis, unable to function. So that's not the answer. But what happens when we consider innovation and creativity in other ways? Usually we think of those two practices as being applicable to material culture, to technology. But what if we applied them to this fundamental human problem, the problem of our fear of the unknown? Can we harness fear using creativity and innovation into the creation of lives that are not controlled by what we are most afraid of, that are less passive and more engaged? Is it possible to confront our fear of the unknown with story? Let's consider two phrases. Once upon a time, and the only lasting truth is change. The first is familiar to all of us. It is what we remember from childhood, our parents telling us and reading to us an incantation that would put us to sleep. It also represents narrative. And narrative is the way that we as human beings make meaning in the world and confront the complexities that we are faced with. Fortunately, these days, it's not just literature professors who are saying this. We are, in fact, in an era when science is validating the importance of narrative. Experiments at Emory University in 2013 demonstrated that when you read a novel, your cerebral cortex is actually transformed. Yay! We in the humanities and the liberal arts, and especially in the literature departments, were delighted to find that this was the case. And so we have data now to support what we've always known. The second phrase, the only lasting truth is change. I don't want this to be true. I want to believe that there are other things that are permanent truths, but arguably there are not. What would they be? Love, happiness, friendship? None of those are permanent when we look at them carefully. So this reality that change is the controlling principle of our lives is very hard for us to comprehend because our physiology, our very bodies, deny that. And again, in science, neuroengineer Leif Finkel has demonstrated through his study of the evolution of phobia that what has happened to human beings is that we have evolved to see permanence where it doesn't exist. And so the world, in some ways, is an illusion of our own creation. And he writes beautifully about this, saying, the world, to a large extent, is a vision of our own creation. And amid this tenuous situation, our cortex makes up little stories of the world and softly hums them to us to help us to keep from getting scared at night. So let's consider the crossroads. Let's consider what happens when narrative and change intersect. What then is possible is to look at the intersection of the crossroad. All of us have a story, and that story will be interrupted by an event that will change it. Back in 2012, when I had my near accident, my husband was very upset by it and wanted to spend time talking about it and thinking about it. But I did not. I wanted to move on, and in fact, his preoccupation with it rather annoyed me. Again, I missed an opportunity that I want you all to have access to. It's useful to think about the crossroads as having two types of components. The first is the crossroads of opportunity, and that is when I entered the intersection without consequence. And the second is the irrevocable crossroad. And that is what would have happened had I entered that intersection and been killed or permanently maimed. And I believe the former has a great deal to teach us about the latter. The symbol of the crossroad is pervasive cross-culturally. In almost every mythology in the world, the symbol of the crossroad figures as an important feature. So I think it points us to the necessity of looking at the crossroad as something that we can use to unpack our fear of the unknown. In ancient Europe, the crossroad was seen as a place of fear that was apart from the center of what was happening. And it was a place where suicides were buried and people were hanged. And I think we've inherited that sense that what the crossroad represents is something to be avoided. But what happens if we turn and face the reality of the unknown? What can unpacking that crossroad teach us? I believe there are 4 principles that the crossroad can help us to understand: inconstancy, paradox, mystery, and choice. We all are easily lulled into routine and habit. And as we walk through our day, we go to school, we have our habits of dealing with each other, taking care of our children, taking care of our friends, making love to our partners. And it's easy to forget that habit, that pattern will change. The story of Romeo and Juliet can be instructive in this way. As you all know, the two fall in love very quickly, and Romeo is trying to pledge his sincere love to Juliet. In so doing, he sort of looks around for something to swear on, and as guys are apt to do, and he finds the moon, because they're outside. And looking at the moon, he swears his undying love for Juliet. And Juliet says, "Oh, swear not by the inconstant moon." And why does she do that? Because she understands that that's a symbol that is variable, that's changeable, and cannot be relied upon. But in fact, although Juliet's logic makes sense, she's not right. The world and the love that Juliet and Romeo express for each other is changeable. And our experience is likewise changeable. If we saw the moon as a representation of our experience, it might help us to accept inconstancy. Paradox, the very symbol of the crossroads, is configured as a bringing together of oppositions. And too often we look at one side or the other, love and hate, black and white, right and wrong. But what the paradox of the crossroads teaches us is that we must look at the center, at what's complicated. In the story of Eshu, which comes from Yoruban culture from West Africa, Eshu is walking through a field one day, and he sees two workers, and he greets them both. And at the end of the day, the two workers say, "Did you see Eshu's hat?" And the other one says, "Yeah, I did." The first guy says again, "It was a beautiful red hat." And the second says, "No, his hat was black." And they get into a terrible fight and start beating each other and nearly beat each other to death. Eshu appears and shows them his hat. And his hat on one side is red, and on the other side is black. And what this story teaches us is that both men were right and both men were wrong. It shows us the paradox of the complicated paradoxes of our existence. What happens so often is that we choose one side or the other, and we want to fight to prove that it's right. Look at the Republicans and the Democrats, for example, if you want an example of that. The third lesson of the crossroads is mystery. And I turn now to another love story of Eurydice and Orpheus. And Orpheus was a master musician, and his music was said to charm even the gods and persuade them to do his will. As the two are walking through a field, Eurydice is bitten on the heel by a snake, and she's taken immediately into the underworld. And Orpheus is distraught. But he decides to use his music to try and persuade Hades, the god of the underworld, to free Eurydice. So he journeys down, and his music does just that, frees Eurydice with one condition. Hades says, "You must not look back, or Eurydice will come back to Hades forever." So the two begin their ascent into the world. And just as Orpheus reaches the threshold and feels the sun on his face, he looks back at Eurydice, and she is lost to him forever. This story brings to mind all of the questions that are an inherent part of the crossroads. Why does Eurydice get bitten by the snake? Why does she have to die? Why does Hades put conditions on her release? And finally, why does Orpheus look back? Any crossroads we encounter will provide us with unanswerable questions. What happens to Orpheus after Eurydice's permanent disappearance is that he is completely without any solace. He is completely bereft, and he's rent apart, ripped limb from limb. And his head, separated from his body, floats down the river, singing of his loss of Eurydice. And what that story represents is that on one side of the crossroads is what has happened, and on the other is a new reality that after crossing through the intersection, one has to grapple with. And Orpheus is unable to do that. Orpheus cannot see a future. That's one choice of the crossroads. The other is represented in Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved, by two characters, Setha and Paul D. And these two have similarly, like Orpheus, been rent apart by experience, particularly by the institution of slavery. And yet they're able to come together through love and to gather, as Morrison says, the pieces of themselves and to put them together and to create a new story. That ability to create a new story is one choice after one experiences the crossroads. And the dismembering grief of Orpheus is another. There is a space in the middle of the crossroads that must be followed by the catch of breath. In those moments, tenacity and imagination reveal to each of us who we are. 4 weeks after my near accident, my husband went for a physical. And he called me after the physical and said he was delighted with the results. The doctor had found that his cholesterol was lower, that his blood pressure was down, and that he had lost weight. So he was over the moon, and we were both very happy with the results. It also happened to be our youngest daughter's 5th birthday. So we went home to celebrate her birthday, and as we were blowing out the candles, the cell phone rang, and it was my husband's doctor telling him immediately to go to the emergency room because his white blood cell count was 10 times what it was supposed to be. We imagined that it was an infection and that it would be easily remedied. When my husband went to the hospital, he was given a CAT scan, which revealed that he had stage 4 kidney cancer. He had 4 months to live. Despite the best efforts of Adam at Wally and the brilliant team at NIH, the next 4 months were like watching your beloved fall from a high skyscraper in slow motion and not being able to do anything to change the outcome. I wish that I had had the lessons of the crossroad to grapple with the inconstancy, the paradox, the mystery, and the choice that came out of this new crossroad that we faced. Inconstancy. From the moment of that phone call, our lives were different, forever changed. Paradox. My husband had never been seriously ill a day in his life, and he was dying. Mystery. If, when we went to the doctor in July with my husband's back pain, if they'd taken it more seriously and done a different test, would my husband still be alive? And finally, choice. What happened to me and my family, and most particularly to my husband, is not unusual. It is not uncommon. It is life. I did not imagine that my story would intersect with change in a way that would make me, in my 40s, a widow and a single mother. But what I have learned is that every day is a choice, either to give into the dismembering grief of Orpheus or to try and reconstitute a new whole. What I have also learned, that I could not possibly have learned without this experience, is that love is at the center of the intersection, and that human beings have a great amount of compassion and caring for each other. So remember when I talked about going into each other's bedrooms? Really understanding is the solution for the fear. Change and uncertainty may be the organizing principle of the human experience, but love is the common denominator. Love, joy, art, and hope, what Emily Dickinson called the thing with feathers that perches in the soul, can survive the crossroad. Narrative and change can engender choice and possibility. What crossroads are in your future? What can narrative teach you that will allow you to navigate those spaces and to survive whole? The crossroads can be survived, and the lessons that they have to teach can allow us to navigate loss, disappointment, change, trauma, even death, with more agility and grace. There is a place in the middle of the crossroads that must be followed by the catch of breath. In those moments, tenacity and imagination teach us all who we are and who we might become. Thank you.